The Kansas Civil War, also known as Bleeding Kansas, from 1854 to 1859, exceeded the usual definition of bloody and brutal. It terrorized innocent people. In 1856, this violence dominated the lives of citizens on city streets, in rural villages, and on the floor of the United States Senate. More specifically, on May 21st, 1856, pro-slavery Democrats and Missourians ransacked homes and destroyed 2 anti-slavery newspaper offices in Lawrence, Kansas. The next day, in the nation's capital, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, using his cane, beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts over the head to within an inch of his life. The previous day, Sumner had taken to the floor of the Senate to deliver his crime against Kansas speech. He denounced Democrats who he said laid in bed with the harlot slavery. 2 days later, at a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown led his sons and other followers on an attack. These attackers dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. Brown and his men next began planning a full-scale slave insurrection with financial support from a small group of Boston abolitionists known as the Secret Six. The violence in 1856 culminated when a pro-slavery and anti-slavery force clashed at the Battle of Osawatomie. John Brown's son was among those killed. Back in Washington, D.C., the legislative and executive branches of government tried to find a solution to the strife caused by the expansion of slavery into the territories. The Compromise of 1850 had replaced the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Some lawmakers proposed popular sovereignty as a means to establishing acceptable territorial governments and states. But this approach failed to resolve the issue. In 1854, settlers, most from the north, began to cross into Kansas to set up homesteads without using enslaved persons. Then a year of intimidation of free state voters and election fraud ended with pro-slavery Missourians pouring into Kansas to vote. They elected a pro-slavery territorial legislature. In response, in the fall of 1855, free state voters called for a constitutional convention in Topeka. The convention drafted the Topeka Constitution, which banned slavery in Kansas and furthermore prevented free blacks from living there. Most pro-slavery advocates boycotted the territorial-wide vote that approved the Topeka Constitution. Still, the political situation in Kansas remained a mess. The pro-slavery territorial government did not dissolve, but it relocated to Lecompton. A congressional committee arrived in Lecompton to investigate voter fraud in April of 1856. They found that non-Kansas residents illegally voted in the election, resulting in the election of a pro-slavery government for Kansas. The committee reported their findings to President Franklin Pierce. Pierce rejected the committee's findings and continued to support the pro-slavery legislature. Next, President Pierce ordered 400 regular Army dragoons to disperse the original Free State legislature in Topeka to make Kansas a slave state. It was July 4th, 1856. Pierce and Congress failed to end the crisis in Kansas. Indeed, Pierce's efforts just threw gasoline on the fire. Popular sovereignty, allowing the resident citizens to decide, did not peacefully solve the question of whether or not slavery would be allowed in the territories. The new president-elect, James Buchanan, believed he had a better solution to the problem. Let the Supreme Court decide. To what degree Buchanan influenced Chief Justice Roger Taney's decision in the Dred Scott case remains questionable. We know the court's ruling overjoyed President Buchanan. Buchanan confidently announced that slavery now existed in Kansas. At the time of Buchanan's inauguration, there were two different capitals in Kansas, two different legislatures, and soon two different constitutions. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois said the Republican Party would not accept the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. Senator Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, said Lincoln's response was insurrectionary. Lincoln reminded Douglas that in the case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, President Andrew Jackson had simply ignored the High Court's decision. Amidst this wrangling, the sectional divide in the nation widened. America's great experiment in representative democracy was floundering. 2 months after the Dred Scott decision, President Buchanan appointed Robert John Walker of Mississippi to be the territorial governor of Kansas. Walker soon discovered that anti-slavery settlers outnumbered pro-slavery settlers in the territory. Walker planned to get Kansas admitted to the Union as a free state that would vote with the Democrats, much like California. However, the fraudulently elected territorial legislature met in Lecompton and adopted a pro-slavery constitution. The Lecompton Constitution protected the rights of slaveholders and provided for a referendum. A constitution with slavery or a constitution with no slavery? The constitution with no slavery would merely ban the future importation of slaves into Kansas. The Free Soilers boycotted the referendum, so the constitution with slavery passed. Territorial Governor John Walker resigned, citing apparent voting fraud and improper political pressure from the Buchanan administration as his cause. On January 4th, 1858, Kansas voters finally rejected the Lecompton Constitution. The next day, the Topeka Constitution that banned slavery went to Congress, and Southerners immediately rejected that result. On February 2nd, despite the show of support for a free Kansas, President Buchanan, believing he must prevent Southern secession and preserve the Union, endorsed the Lecompton Constitution and recommended Kansas join the Union as a slave state. A series of events then ensued, events which altered the political landscape over the next 33 months. Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, broke with his party and publicly stated he would vote no on Lecompton. Douglas, up for re-election in the fall and championing the use of popular sovereignty, would not run on a platform that supported the federal government forcing slavery on Kansas. His rebelliousness made him more popular in Illinois, yet made him a pariah with Southern Democrats and Buchanan. Still, even with Douglas's no vote, the Senate approved the Lecompton Constitution in March. Half the Northern Democrats in the House, however, sided with Douglas. It was a bizarre coalition that voted no. Anti-slavery Democrats, Republicans, and some border state representatives like John C. Crittenden of Kentucky, who believed the Kansas Constitution was wrong. Crittenden proposed a straight up or down congressional vote on the Kansas question. Such a vote placed Republicans in a tight spot because a vote for Crittenden's suggestion would endorse popular sovereignty. Finally, representatives compromised after several months of contentious debates and even a brawl in the House between Galashua A. Grau of Pennsylvania and Lawrence Kett of South Carolina. Alexander Stephens, a conservative Whig from Georgia, proposed another solution. Offer the people of Kansas a choice. Vote to accept the federal government's 4 million acre land grant to Kansas, and you get the Lecompton Constitution. Vote the land grant down and remain without a constitution. Congress passed the bill, and the white males of Kansas defeated it 11,000 to 2,000. This defeat temporarily ended the Kansas issue. The election of 1858 demonstrated the national fallout from this year-long battle in Kansas. Swing voters had cast their ballots for Millard Fillmore and the Know Nothing Party 2 years before, in 1856. Now they cast their votes for the Republican Party, showing their anger over what the Buchanan administration had tried to do in Kansas. By 1858, the Republicans had become the dominant party in the North. Historian Eric Foner argued that this voter swing decided the presidential election of 1860. For the Democrats to recover from the political losses they experienced in the 1858 midterm elections, they had to unite the party. That is not what they did. The vendetta against Stephen Douglas continued. He was stripped of his position as chairman of the Committee on Territories. The Buchanan administration supported the Republican Abraham Lincoln instead of Douglas in the latter's re-election bid. The Kansas turmoil began to fade as the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the summer and fall of 1858 captured the nation's attention. Nevertheless, the struggle over establishing Kansas as a free state or slave state infected the body politic with poisonous results that would soon lead to more dangerous consequences. Consequences that still plague the United States 164 years later. So far, as a nation, we found no immunity or cure.